The alarm was already screaming when I reached the bridge. Not a drill, not a test. The Galactic Conclave's broadcast signal had punched through every frequency we owned, and the voice on the other end was not speaking to us as equals. It never did. The Vraxi delegate, a creature with 4 long arms and a jaw that moved sideways when it spoke, had interrupted our FTL calibration sequence to deliver a message to all of humanity. And that message was simple. We were being laughed at. My name is Ilara Voss. I was 34 years old when Earth sent me to the Conclave as its first official ambassador, and I was 34 years old when I understood, fully and without any doubt, that the universe had already decided what we were. We were a footnote. We were a late arrival at a party that had been going on for 10,000 years without us. We were, in the words of the Shen Hai delegate, a species that had learned to dream a century too late. I remember standing on the observation deck of our transit vessel, the Adrian, watching the Conclave station grow larger in the viewport. It was enormous. Not beautiful, not to human eyes, but enormous. A structure the size of a small moon, ringed with docking arms that held ships from 47 different species. Ships that made ours look like a child had drawn them. Ships with smooth, organic curves and engines that pulsed with colors we had no names for yet. Our vessel, the Adrian, was boxy and gray, and carried the faint smell of recycled air that never quite went away no matter how many times engineering tried to fix it. Lieutenant Owen Marsh walked up beside me and looked out the same viewport. He was my aide, 26, sharp as a blade, and he had a habit of saying the thing everyone else was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. "They are going to eat us alive in there," he said. "They are going to try," I told him. We docked without ceremony. No welcome signal, no escort of honor, nothing. A Conclave maintenance drone guided us in automatically, the same as it would guide in a supply freighter. We filed out through the docking corridor in our dress uniforms, all 12 members of the delegation, and the first beings we encountered were a group of Vraxi soldiers standing near the corridor junction. They looked at us. Then one of them made a sound deep in its throat, a low, rolling sound, and the others responded the same way. They were not threatening us. They were laughing. We had not even reached the main hall yet. I kept walking. I kept my face still. I had practiced that face in the mirror for 3 months before this posting. The Conclave chamber itself was designed to make every species feel small except the ones who built it. The ceiling was so high it was lost in haze. The seating arrangement placed the founding species, the Vraxi, the Shen, the Kalori, and the Meth, in elevated tiers at the center. Everyone else sat lower, angled upward as if in permanent deference. I found the human delegation seats. They were on the outer ring, lower than everyone, with a partial view blocked by a Kalori structural pillar. I sat down. Owen sat beside me and quietly pointed out that the translation device built into our seat panel was slightly different from every other panel in the chamber. Older model. The Conclave had given us their spare. I noted it. I did not react. The session opened with what the Conclave called a welcoming declaration for new member candidates. The Shen Hai delegate, a tall creature with skin like polished stone and 3 sets of eyes that never seemed to blink at the same time, read the declaration in the common trade language. The translation came through our earpieces half a second late, tinny and flat. The declaration was a formality. What followed was not. The Kalori military observer, a species that had been spacefaring for 9,000 years, asked to address the chamber regarding human military readiness. This was unusual. Typically, military assessments were submitted in writing, but the Kalori delegate had asked to speak, and the Conclave allowed it, and so I sat in my blocked outer ring seat and listened to a being from a 9,000-year civilization explain to 47 other species exactly why humanity was not ready to be here. It was clinical. That was what made it so sharp. The delegate did not raise its voice. It did not use insulting language. It simply presented data. Human FTL capability rated primitive. Human weapons technology rated insufficient for Conclave defense requirements. Human reaction time in simulated combat scenarios rated concerning. Human biological fragility, rated extreme by interstellar standards. Human lifespan, rated short. There was a word the delegate used in the Kalori language that the translation rendered as recreational. As in, human military vessels were adequate for recreational patrol within a single solar system. I heard the laughter begin before the translation even finished. Not from one section, from everywhere. From the Vraxi tier, from the Shen delegates, from species I had not even identified yet. A rolling wave of amusement, in sounds ranging from clicks to rumbles to something like wind through pipes, washing across that enormous chamber and landing on 12 human beings sitting in the outer ring behind a structural pillar. Owen's hand tightened on his data pad. I could see it from the corner of my eye. I did not move. I did not look down. I found a point on the far wall and I held it with my eyes, and I let every sound in that room pass through me like I was made of glass, and I thought about one thing only. I thought about how much data we were collecting right now. The weapons configurations on every ship in this station. The communication protocols. The translation delays that told us where their system weaknesses were. The laughter itself, which told us exactly how safe they felt, which told us exactly how little they had prepared for us. When the laughter faded, I requested the floor. The Shen delegate looked at me the way you look at something that has interrupted a meal. But conclave rules allowed any member candidate to speak, and they could not refuse without breaking protocol, and whatever they thought of us, they followed their own rules. The floor was granted. I walked to the speaker's position. I did not use notes. I had not prepared a speech because I had known before we ever docked that no speech was going to change what this chamber thought of us today. Speeches were for when people were listening. Today was for something else. I looked up at the elevated tiers. I looked at the Kalori delegate specifically, and I spoke in the common trade language without the earpiece, because I had spent 2 years learning it before this posting. I said that Earth thanked the conclave for the assessment. I said that we found it thorough and that we intended to study it carefully. I said that humanity had a tradition when given an honest evaluation of where it stood, and that tradition was not to argue with the evaluation. The tradition was to go home and get to work. Then I said one more thing. I said it quietly, and I said it without any expression on my face, and I said it directly to the Kalori military observer who had just called our ships recreational. I said, "We will be back." I walked back to my seat. Owen was looking at me with an expression I could not fully read. Somewhere between admiration and the particular look people get when they realize the situation is more serious than they thought. The session continued. Our membership petition was put to a preliminary vote later that same day. It failed. Not narrowly. The result was 39 against, 6 abstentions, 2 in favor. 2 out of 47. One of those 2 was a small species called the Uvathi, who had only been spacefaring for 300 years and had apparently not forgotten what it felt like to be new. The other was a species called the Brennath, and I later learned that they voted in favor simply because they had a philosophical tradition against voting against anything they had not directly studied. It was not support. It was bureaucratic caution. We filed back to the Adrian. Nobody spoke in the docking corridor. Our footsteps echoed. A Vraxi maintenance worker watched us walk past and said something to a colleague, and even without the translation I could tell from the sound and the posture what it was. Owen broke the silence when we reached the ship. He sat down in the crew lounge and put his face in his hands for a moment, and then he looked up and said, "What do we do now?" I sat across from him. I thought about the conclave chamber. I thought about the laughter. I thought about the 2 votes. I thought about the data we had collected simply by being there, by being dismissed, by being seen as something so small that nobody bothered to guard their conversations near us. "We go home," I said. And then I looked at him. I thought about everything I had been keeping behind that still face for the past 12 hours. I thought about 9,000 years of Kalori history that had produced such absolute confidence in their own superiority that they could not even imagine a reason to prepare for us. "Then we get to work," I said. I sent one transmission back to Earth before we left the station's communication range. It was not a report. It was not a diplomatic brief. It was a single sentence to Director Calvin Webb, the head of Earth's Defense Science Division, a man I had known for 10 years and trusted completely. The sentence was, "They do not fear us, they never will, and that is the only advantage we will ever need." I watched the conclave station shrink in the viewport as the Adrian pulled away, and the stars around it looked cold and very far apart, and I thought that the universe was a quiet and enormous place, and that somewhere inside it, 12 human beings were carrying home the most useful thing we had ever been given. Not a welcome, not respect, not a vote in our favor. A clear picture of exactly how far we had to go. That was the last time I ever asked for anything. Director Calvin Webb did not sleep much. I knew this because in the 11 months since I had returned from the conclave, I had called him at irregular hours no fewer than 40 times, and he had answered every single one. Not groggy, not slow, always sharp, always already thinking 3 steps ahead of the conversation. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had once been athletic, and then spent 2 decades behind a desk and made peace with it. And he had a habit of tapping his right index finger against whatever surface was nearest when he was working through a problem, which meant that the conference table in his office had a faint but visible dent in the surface from years of exactly that. My name is Dr. Nathan Cole. I was the lead physicist on what Director Webb called, officially, Advanced Propulsion and Defense Research Initiative 7. What the rest of us called it, in the locked rooms where only cleared personnel could speak freely, was Project Ironville. I want to explain what we were building and why it worked, because the universe at large had a theory about human beings and physics, and that theory was wrong in a way so fundamental that I am not sure the conclave ever fully understood what they missed. The theory went like this. Intelligent species that reach spacefaring capability follow a predictable arc. They move from brute force physics to refined physics. Early ships are big and loud and wasteful. Advanced ships are small and precise and efficient. A 9,000-year-old civilization like the Kalori had long since passed through the brute force stage and arrived at something elegant. Their weapons were surgical. Their engines were whisper quiet. Their entire military doctrine was built around the idea that the most advanced thing a civilization could do was apply the minimum force necessary to achieve an objective. Precision was the highest expression of intelligence, in their view. They were not wrong about the arc. Most species followed it. They were wrong about us. Humanity did not follow the arc because humanity had never been given the arc. We had spent 200,000 years on a planet that was actively trying to end us, not metaphorically, literally. Ice ages, volcanic winters, droughts, predators, disease, and most relentlessly of all each other. We had spent most of our recorded history in conflict with ourselves, which meant that our entire technological development happened in parallel with a constant, unbroken pressure to find new and more effective ways to deliver force at range. We did not refine our way out of the brute force phase. We refined the brute force phase itself. We became extraordinarily good at it. We made it elegant in its own way, the elegance of a hammer that never breaks, of a system that keeps working no matter what you throw at it, of a weapon that does not require perfect conditions to function. The Kalori looked at our ships and saw primitive technology. What they were actually seeing was a design philosophy they had not used in 7,000 years and had completely forgotten how to counter. I joined Ironville 14 months after Alara's return from the conclave. Webb recruited me directly, which meant a car showing up at my university office one Tuesday morning, and a man in a gray suit telling me that my expertise in graviton compression dynamics was urgently required in a location he could not yet name. I had been working on a theoretical model for what I called impact stacking, a method of layering multiple kinetic and gravitational force vectors, so that their combined effect at a single point was several orders of magnitude greater than any individual component. On paper, the math worked beautifully. In practice, it required a delivery system that did not exist. At Ironville, I discovered that the delivery system had been under construction for 9 months. The facility was inside Jupiter's shadow, in the gravitational lee of the gas giant where long-range conclave sensors would read only background noise. It was not a small facility. It was, by the time I arrived, the largest construction project in human history, and the people working in it were some of the most relentless, quietly driven individuals I had ever met. They worked long hours not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Every engineer, every physicist, every systems technician in that facility had seen the conclave broadcast. They had all heard the laughter. Nobody talked about it directly, but it was there, in the hours they kept and the pace they set and the particular look in their eyes when they stood in front of a problem and refused to leave until it was solved. Motivation is a complicated thing. Fear produces short bursts. Obligation produces steady work. But humiliation, genuine and public humiliation, produces something else entirely. It produces a very quiet, very long-burning kind of determination that does not run out. I met the lead propulsion engineer on my 3rd day, a woman named Dr. Lena Caro, who was responsible for the engine configuration on all 14 hulls. She was 48, methodical to the point of seeming cold, and she had a habit of finishing other people's sentences before they could, which was sometimes irritating and sometimes useful depending on whether she was right. She was almost always right. She walked me through the engine design over 4 hours with a whiteboard full of equations that I genuinely found beautiful, and at the end she asked me if I had any concerns. I had one concern. The impact stacking delivery system I had designed required a specific kind of targeting window, a window that would only open properly if the ship was stationary for approximately 3 seconds before firing. 3 seconds in combat, against an enemy that had been running precision warfare for millennia, felt like a long time. Lena looked at my concern, then looked at her whiteboard, then said we needed to design a secondary kinetic system that could run while the primary was charging. Something that would keep an enemy ship moving to a predictable position during those 3 seconds. Something that would make the 3-second window irrelevant because the enemy would not know the window existed. We spent 11 months on that problem. The solution we arrived at was not elegant by conclave standards. It was not elegant by any standards except ours. It was a layered suppression system that combined traditional mass driver fire with a graviton pulse that disrupted enemy engine output without triggering their weapons alert sensors. It looked, on any scanner that was not specifically calibrated for it, like ordinary electromagnetic interference from the ship's own systems. The enemy would experience engine instability, assume it was their own problem, attempt to compensate, and in doing so hold a predictable course for approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds was more than enough. The hulls themselves were another place where we departed completely from the conclave model. Every advanced species in the conclave built ships with distributed architecture, spreading critical systems across the entire vessel, so that damage to any one section did not compromise the whole. It was sound doctrine. It was also resource-intensive and required extremely precise construction tolerances that took decades to develop. We did not have decades. We built our ships with redundant architecture instead, not distributed, redundant. Every critical system was duplicated 3 times and placed in 3 separate armored sections. If one section was destroyed, the system switched to the backup. If the backup was destroyed, the system switched to the emergency backup. The emergency backups were slower and less efficient than the primary, but they worked. They kept working after taking damage that would have crippled a conclave vessel, because conclave vessels were built on the assumption that their precision would prevent them from taking that much damage in the first place. We made no such assumption. The ships were not beautiful. They were dense and angular, and they looked like something designed by someone who was deeply serious about not being destroyed, which was accurate. Captain Gareth Holt, the first hull commander to take his ship through live fire testing, described the feel of the vessel as, and I am quoting directly from his test report, like sitting inside something that has decided it is not going to stop. That was the most accurate description I ever heard of what we built. There were 14 hulls in total, not because 14 was a strategic number, but because 14 was what the materials, the facility, and the timeline allowed. Director Webb had made a decision early in the program that I initially questioned and later understood completely. He had forbidden any communication with the Conclave about Ironville's existence. No hints in diplomatic channels, no leaks, no test signals that might be intercepted. The Conclave, in their confidence, had made no effort to observe what humanity was doing in the outer solar system. They were not looking, and we were not going to tell them to look. The 14th hull was completed on a Tuesday morning, 4 years and 7 months after I joined the program. I was standing in the observation bay when the final systems check came back clean across all boards, and the technician running the check, a young man named Oliver Grant, looked up from his console and said, 14 for 14, in the same tone someone might use to announce that coffee was ready. And then he went back to his checklist. I walked to the viewport and looked at the ships. All 14 of them in formation, dark against Jupiter's swirling clouds, carrying inside them the product of every sleepless hour, every problem we had refused to leave unsolved, every quiet burning determination of every person in that facility. The Conclave thought they knew what humanity was. They had looked at us for approximately 30 seconds, decided we were not worth understanding, and moved on. That was going to cost them. I went back to my workstation. My hands were steady. My coffee was cold. I did not notice either of these things because I was already thinking about the next calculation, the next system check, the next thing that had to be perfect before we were done. We were not done yet, but we were close. Every equation I solved had their laughter somewhere inside it. Alara's transmission arrived at Ironville at 4 in the morning, station time, and it took 7 minutes for the duty officer to decide it was important enough to wake me for. My name is Dr. Nathan Cole. I am telling this part of the story because I was there, and because what happened next is the kind of thing that changes the weight of everything you have built. Until that morning, Ironville was a program, a project, an enormous and complex answer to a question the universe had asked us in the worst possible way. After that morning, it was something else. It was the only thing standing between humanity and the understanding that we had been completely and permanently removed from the future. The Vraxi had hit Keth Colony. I need to explain what Keth was. It was not a military outpost. It was not a strategic position in any sense that a purely military mind would recognize. Keth was our first colony outside the solar system, established 11 years earlier on a world that was not particularly rich in resources and not particularly hospitable in climate, and not particularly close to anything the Conclave considered valuable. We had chosen it precisely because nobody else wanted it. We had gone there because it was ours, because we had built it, because 3 million people had made it their home and planted gardens and raised children in the thin air under a pale sun that was not quite like any sun they had grown up under. The Vraxi called it a territorial clarification. That was the phrase used in the official Conclave broadcast, which came 3 hours after the strike. A territorial clarification. The Vraxi had decided that the Keth system fell within a spatial boundary they were asserting, and since humanity was not a full Conclave member, there was no formal procedure for complaint. The broadcast noted that the action had been proportionate, and that any future human presence in the Keth system without prior Vraxi approval would be treated similarly. 900,000 people. That number is not abstract to me. I had been to Keth twice, for systems testing on the colony's experimental communication array. I had eaten breakfast in a diner in Keth's main settlement, and the woman who served me was named Carol, and she had a photograph behind the counter of two children standing in front of something she had grown in her garden, something green and improbable in that pale light, and she had pointed at it when she saw me looking and said, "First real tomatoes on Keth." 3 years it took. She had said it the way people say things they are proud of, the quiet kind of proud, the kind that does not need an audience. I thought about Carol when I read the numbers. I thought about the photograph. I did not hear the duty officer leave my quarters. I do not know how long I sat with the transmission before I moved. I remember walking to the observation viewport, the same one where I had stood when the 14th hull was completed, and looking at the ships and feeling something I do not have a precise word for. Not rage, exactly. Rage burns hot and fast. This was something with more structure to it. Rage with mathematics inside it. Anger that had already converted itself into purpose before I even noticed it happening. The Emergency War Council convened on Earth 48 hours later. I was patched in via secure link from Ironville, along with Gareth Holt and Lena Caro and Director Webb. Alara was there in person. She had returned to Earth immediately after Keth, cutting a diplomatic visit to the outer stations short and traveling at the fastest speed the Adrian could manage. I watched her on the feed. She walked into the council chamber, which was a large room full of serious people with the weight of 900,000 dead and 3 million displaced on every face. She sat down. She did not speak immediately. She reached into the case she was carrying, and she set an object on the center of the conference table. It was a small data chip. Standard format, gray casing, nothing on the outside to identify it. She said, "That is the Keth death registry. Every name, every age, every settlement district. If anyone in this room wants to read it before we begin, I will wait." Nobody moved. "Then we begin," she said. "Ironville now." 2 words. That was the entirety of her formal request to the council. 2 words and a data chip on a table. The council was not a rubber stamp. They asked questions, they demanded projections, they wanted probability assessments and tactical outlines and contingency frameworks. Gareth Holt answered the military questions. Lena Caro answered the engineering questions. Director Webb answered the resource and logistics questions. I answered the physics questions. We had prepared for all of them, not for this meeting specifically, but because we had been preparing for the moment when someone would need to understand what we had built and why it would work. The questions took 6 hours. The authorization took 4 minutes. The vote was unanimous. I remember the moment the authorization came through on the Ironville station feed. The operations room was full. Not noisily full, the kind of full where people are standing at the edges of a room because there is no more space and nobody wants to be anywhere else. The authorization signal came up on the main display, green text on a dark background, and for approximately 3 seconds the room was completely silent. Then Oliver Grant, who was sitting at the main systems console, did something I had not seen him do in 4 years of working beside him. He leaned back in his chair, looked up at the ceiling, and exhaled very slowly. That was all. That was the entirety of the reaction in that room. A single long exhale from one man, and then everyone was at their stations and the room was moving. Gareth Holt spoke to all 14 hull commanders on a combined channel, and his words were brief and functional. He gave coordinates. He gave a departure window. He said that everything they had trained for, and everything the program had built toward was now in effect, and that he expected each ship to be ready to leave Jupiter's shadow in 96 hours. Every ship was ready in 78. I watched them go from the observation viewport, all 14, in staggered formation, pulling away from the facility and from Jupiter's vast amber curve and from everything that had been their world for years. They moved slowly at first, because the facility's close proximity traffic protocols required it, and then the formation cleared the threshold and the engines went a full burn and they were gone. The viewport was just stars after that. Lena Caro appeared beside me. She had a coffee in each hand, and she gave me one without asking whether I wanted it, which was characteristic of her. We stood there for a moment, not saying anything. She said the suppression system held perfectly in the final live fire. I said, I know. She said 4.3 seconds average window, best result we ever got. I said, I know. She drank her coffee. I drank mine. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same as they always were, cold and very far apart and completely indifferent to everything we had just set in motion. Do you think they are ready? She asked. I thought about that. I thought about Gareth Holt, who had a gift for the kind of calm that spreads outward from a commander and steadies everyone around them. I thought about the 14 hulls, dense and angular and redundant and absolutely uninterested in stopping. I thought about 4 years and 7 months of sleepless hours and cold coffee and problems that refused to be easy. I thought about Carol and the photograph. They are ready, I said. Lena nodded once, the same way she acknowledged a correct answer on a whiteboard, decisive and complete. We were the only 2 people left at the viewport by then. Everyone else had gone back to work, to the monitoring systems and the communication arrays and the 1,000 details that would need tracking over the coming days. The facility hummed around us with the particular sound of a place that has sent its best thing out into the world and now waits. Grief is the cleanest fuel there is. I had heard Ilara say that once, months ago, in a corridor outside the council link room, to no one in particular. I had not fully understood it at the time. I understood it now. This is the part where I tell you what 14 human dreadnoughts looked like when they dropped out of FTL, inside Vraxi defensive space. My name is Ilara Voss. I was on the bridge of the lead ship, the Dreadnought Unbroken in the command position, with a headset connecting me to all 13 other hulls, and a display board in front of me that was showing me everything our sensors could reach. Gareth Holt was in the tactical seat to my right, and his hands were resting open and flat on the armrest in a way I had noticed before and understood now. It was how he looked when he was completely ready. The micro-jump was Nathan's idea, or rather it was the physical product of Nathan's mathematics, which Gareth had taken and turned into tactical doctrine over the preceding 3 years. A standard FTL approach into an enemy system required a deceleration window that gave any defending force between 8 and 12 minutes of advance warning. 12 minutes was enough time for any conclave military force to move from standard patrol formation to full combat posture. The Vraxi defense fleet around Shaw Prime was significant. Not overwhelming, but significant, and 12 minutes was a long time. The micro-jump used a technique the Conclave had reviewed and formally classified as theoretically reckless, which meant they had looked at the mathematics, confirmed that it worked, and then decided no sane species would attempt it because the error margin was large enough that a miscalculation would deposit the jumping vessel inside solid matter rather than empty space. The error margin was large for precision navigation. It was not large for ships the size of ours, which were designed from the first hull plate to function under conditions that would destroy a ship built for precision. We came out of the jump at what the Vraxi defense systems would have read in the approximately 1 second before those systems went into full alert as an impossible location. We were inside their patrol perimeter, not approaching it, inside it. All 14 of us. The Vraxi Defense Fleet had 42 ships on active patrol around Shaw Prime. I had read their configuration before departure, in the intelligence files that had been assembled through 4 years of careful observation from a species that had been completely dismissed and therefore never watched. 42 ships, fast and precise, and built for the kind of surgical engagement that had been the Conclave's standard for centuries. They were very good at what they did. What they had never trained for was this. The first transmission from the Vraxi fleet commander came 11 seconds after our emergence. It was a standard challenge signal, identification and intent, the kind of signal that every conclave military protocol required before any further action. It arrived on our systems and I looked at it and did not answer, because the time for answering signals had ended on a Tuesday morning 4 months ago when I read a transmission about 900,000 names. Full suppression all hulls, Gareth said, not loudly. The same tone he used for everything, which was one of his gifts. The suppression system rolled out across the entire formation, 14 ships generating a coordinated graviton pulse that hit the Vraxi fleet's engine systems like a hand laid gently on a running machine. Not violent, subtle. Every Vraxi ship experienced a power fluctuation that their diagnostics immediately attributed to local electromagnetic interference. The natural response was to engage stabilization protocols, which required the navigation system to hold a precise compensating course for approximately 4 to 5 seconds. 4 to 5 seconds was more than enough. The impact stacking delivery ran its charge cycle in 3.8 seconds. Nathan had promised 4. His team had shaved 0.2 of a second off the final design and had sent me a message about it that read simply, "Faster than promised." That was the entirety of the message. No explanation, no context, just faster than promised. The first targeting solution locked on the 3 largest Vraxi warships, not to destroy them. The targeting parameters had been set with specific intent. We hit their engine sections. The systems that made them fast, that made them precise, that made them capable of the kind of coordinated surgical response their entire military doctrine was built around. We hit those systems precisely, and we hit them hard enough that the ships were not destroyed, but were, in the language of Gareth's tactical brief, no longer able to do the thing that made them dangerous. The second round of targeting locked the Vraxi fleet's communication array, the hub through which their formation coordination ran. When that array went offline, 42 individually capable ships became 42 ships that could no longer act as one unit. They were still dangerous individually, but they were no longer a fleet in any meaningful sense. The third targeting sequence was the one I had been thinking about since the moment the authorization came through. It locked on the Vraxi command vessel, which was larger than the others and positioned at the center of the formation in the way that command vessels always are, because command vessels are built on the assumption that the center is the safest place. I let that one charge for a full 6 seconds, not because the system needed 6 seconds, because I wanted the Vraxi commander to see what was coming and have time to understand what it represented. Then I answered their challenge signal. I opened the channel and said, "This is Commander Ilara Voss of the Earth Defense Forces. You know why we are here. You know what you did at Keth. This is not a negotiation and it is not a warning. What comes next is a consequence." I closed the channel. Gareth said, "Fire." What happened over the next 40 minutes was not elegant by any standard that the conclave would recognize. It was thorough. It was systematic. It was built on 4 years of accumulated knowledge about exactly how every Vraxi system worked, knowledge gathered while standing in the outer ring of a chamber behind a structural pillar, knowledge gathered from signals intercepted by a species so completely dismissed that nobody had bothered to encrypt their routine traffic near us. It was built on the suppression system and the impact stacking delivery and the redundant architecture that kept our hulls functional through damage levels that would have ended conclave vessels in the first exchange. The Vraxi defense fleet was not destroyed. That was a deliberate choice, and it was mine. Every targeting parameter in that engagement had been set to mission kill rather than total destruction. Engines, weapons arrays, communication systems, command capabilities. We removed the capacity to threaten. We did not remove the ships. We did not remove the crews. Gareth had asked me about that choice before we departed. He had not challenged it. He had asked it as a genuine question, the way Gareth asked everything, looking for the reasoning so he could execute it precisely. I had told him that the conclave was watching, not Shaw Prime specifically, not this engagement specifically, but everything. The conclave had observers and automated monitoring systems throughout inhabited space, and a significant engagement in a home system would register. The entire conclave would see what had happened here, and what I wanted them to see was not a species that had acted in kind. What I wanted them to see was a species that had the capability for total action and had chosen something different, because any species can destroy. The question the Conclave had never asked about us, the question they had assumed they already knew the answer to, was what kind of species we were when we had the power to choose. By the time the engagement ended, the Vraxi fleet was neutralized. All 42 ships were holding position, unable to maneuver, their weapons offline, their formation broken. Shal Prime was untouched. The orbital infrastructure, the stations, the civilian communications networks, all of it was untouched. 3 of our 14 hulls had taken damage. None were destroyed. All 3 were functional on backup systems. The Vraxi commander's channel opened without a challenge signal. It opened with a request. I let it sit for 12 seconds before I answered. When I answered, I said 3 sentences. I said that the Vraxi fleet was to stand down and undergo inspection by human vessels to confirm compliance. I said that negotiations regarding Keth and all related matters would take place on terms set by Earth, not by the Conclave, not by the Vraxi, by Earth. I said that any action against human vessels, colonies, or interests from this moment forward would be met with a response calibrated not to this engagement but to Keth. I did not say please. I did not say we hoped they would agree. I did not leave any room for the exchange of counter-proposals. The Vraxi commander agreed in 40 seconds. Gareth looked at me and said, with the same even tone he used for everything, 40 seconds. That is the fastest treaty acceptance I have ever seen. They had 12 seconds to think while I was waiting to answer, I said. I gave them a head start. He almost smiled. Gareth almost smiling was the equivalent of anyone else laughing. I looked out at Shal Prime through the forward viewport. A blue-gray world, large, with 3 moons that were visible from this distance as bright points. 3 million Vraxi civilians who had woken up this morning on a world that felt safe, that felt certain, that felt like the kind of place where the thing that had happened to Keth could not happen here. I had no interest in changing that. That was not the point. The point was standing in 2 places at once, in this engagement and in the Conclave chamber 4 years ago, and saying, "You were wrong. Not about our ships, not about our weapons, about us. You were wrong about us." I turned to the communications officer, a young woman named Petra Hale, who had been running the broadcast systems for the entire engagement with a steadiness I intended to mention explicitly in my report. "Open a conclave-wide channel," I said. She looked at me, "Full broadcast." "Full broadcast," I confirmed. She opened it. Every conclave member, every council chamber, every ship within range, and the automated recording systems that would carry the signal further than any of us could currently reach. I said that the human fleet had completed its operation in the Shal Prime system. I said that the Vraxi fleet had accepted terms and that no civilian infrastructure had been touched. I said that humanity was not here to take anything. Not territory, not resources, not pride. We were here because 900,000 people had been removed from the future, and that was not something we were prepared to ignore. I said that we had no interest in conflict with any species that treated us as the species we were. Then I said, "We will be back at the conclave." I closed the channel. The bridge was quiet for a moment, not tense. The particular quiet of a place where something enormous has just finished and the people in it are taking one breath before the next thing begins. Petra Hale said, quietly and to no one in particular, "They heard all of that." "Good," I said. "I did not come here to end a species. I came here to end an idea, the idea that we were ever less than them." A year passed. I want you to understand what that year felt like, because it is easy to read the events of Shal Prime and think that everything after was simple, that the hard part was the battle and the rest was ceremony. It was not. The year after was its own kind of work, and in some ways it was more difficult, because the outcome of that work was not going to be determined by physics or engineering or the suppression system. It was going to be determined by whether we were, in fact, the kind of species we had claimed to be in a full conclave broadcast. My name is Ilara Voss. This is the end of the story and the beginning of everything else. The conclave requested a formal session 4 weeks after Shal Prime, not a petition hearing. A session. There is a difference. A petition hearing places the petitioner in a subordinate position, requesting admission to something that already exists without them. A session is a meeting between parties. The conclave had never requested a session with humanity before. We had always been the ones asking. I traveled to the station on a different ship this time. Not the Adrian. We sent the Adrian into refit and took the transport vessel Cashin, which was newer, and carried a delegation of 22 people instead of 12. Owen Marsh was with me again, 6 years older and no longer the youngest person in any room we walked into together. He had spent the year between the conclave rejection and Keth working on the intelligence side of what would become Ironvale's targeting data, and he had a quietness to him now that was not unhappiness. It was the quietness of someone who had carried heavy things and learned to carry them without showing it. We docked at the conclave station, and the docking corridor was the same corridor I had walked 6 years ago when a Vraxi soldier laughed at us before we reached the main hall. I walked through it again and thought about that soldier, and thought about all the distance between that moment and this one, and I did not feel triumph. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was closer to a kind of clarity, the feeling of a long equation finally resolving to the right answer. Nobody laughed in the corridor this time. We were taken directly to the main chamber, not the outer ring. The chamber had been reconfigured for the session, the tiered seating replaced with a circular arrangement that placed every delegation at the same level. That was not a small gesture. The conclave seating architecture was thousands of years old. Changing it for a single session was the kind of thing that required agreement from every founding member. They had all agreed. The Shen High Delegate, the same one who had read the welcoming declaration 6 years ago, opened the session. The translation in our earpieces was no longer coming from an older model device. Someone had replaced the translation unit at the human delegations table with a current generation system. It was a detail most people would not notice. I noticed it. The first item on the session agenda was the formal review of the Keth incident and the Shal Prime response. This was expected. What was not expected was the framing. The conclave's opening statement did not call Shal Prime a violation of galactic law. It called the Keth strike a violation. That was a significant distinction, and it had not been the conclave's initial framing in the weeks after the incident. Something had shifted in those weeks. Several things had shifted. The Kalori military observer who had given the original assessment 6 years ago was present at the session, not as the lead delegate, not in the elevated position the founding species usually occupied, as an observer, which was the same role humanity had been assigned at its first conclave appearance. I noticed that too. Director Webb had asked me, before I departed for the station, what I expected from the session. I had told him I expected 2 things. One was the formal resolution of the Keth matter and the establishment of terms that protected human interests going forward. The other was the membership vote. He had asked me what I thought the result would be. I had told him I thought it would pass. He had asked me how I knew. I had told him that species who are capable of reconfiguring their seating arrangements and replacing translation equipment have already made the decision. The session was not the decision. The session was the announcement. The formal review took the better part of the morning. Our legal team, led by a woman named Dr. Patricia Hale, who was Petra's older sister and had the same quality of steadiness under pressure, presented the Keth documentation with precision and without theater. The numbers, the evidence, the Vraxi Command records that we had obtained during the inspection period following Shal Prime, which showed clearly that the Keth strike had been authorized at the highest levels of Vraxi leadership and had not been a rogue action or a miscalculation. Every delegation in the chamber had those records by now, because we had sent them to every conclave member 3 weeks after Shal Prime, and the quiet that had followed that distribution had said more than any statement could. The Vraxi delegation accepted full responsibility. The conclave formal record would carry that acceptance. The afternoon session opened with the question of human membership. The Shanghai delegate put the matter to a vote without preamble. The vote was 44 in favor, 0 against, 3 abstentions. The 3 abstentions were technical, 2 species whose internal governance protocols required a formal review period before any vote of this category could be recorded, and 1 species whose delegate had experienced a translation system failure and was unable to certify their vote under conclave rules. All 3 sent formal notifications within the week that they had completed their review, and their vote was in favor. 47 for, 0 against. Owen leaned over when the result displayed and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, 6 years ago we got 2. We earned 47 more, I said. I was given the floor to speak. I had prepared something. I had prepared several versions of something, actually, over the preceding weeks, ranging from a full diplomatic address to a brief statement of acknowledgement. I stood at the speaker's position, which was now at the same level as every other position in the reconfigured chamber, and I looked around at 47 delegations, and I put the prepared remarks aside. I said that Earth was grateful for the vote, and that we took membership in the conclave seriously, meaning that we would uphold every responsibility that came with it the way we expected every other member to uphold theirs. I said that we had not sought the events of the past year, but that we had responded to them as the species we were, and that we intended to remain the species we were. I said that the Uvathi delegation had voted for us 6 years ago when no one else would, and that we had not forgotten that. The Uvathi delegate, a small creature wrapped in layers of pale cloth, inclined its head very slightly. It was the Uvathi equivalent of a deep bow. Their protocol advisor had briefed me on this 3 days earlier. Then I said one thing that I had prepared, 1 sentence. I said, we did not want this seat badly enough to beg for it. We wanted it enough to build what nobody thought we could build. I returned to the human delegation table. Owen handed me a glass of water without a word, which was the right thing to do, and I drank it, and the session moved to the next item on the agenda. After the formal session, there was a reception in the conclave's main gathering hall, which was a long, high-ceilinged space that smelled of something faintly metallic and was lit in a way that made every species look slightly unfamiliar. I moved through it and spoke to delegates and answered questions and shook hands with those species for whom handshaking was a recognized gesture and inclined my head for those for whom it was not. Owen managed the crowd flow with the skill of someone who had been doing exactly this for years, steering me away from conversations that were going nowhere and toward ones that had actual content. The Kalori military observer found me near the far end of the room, not the lead Kalori delegate, the military observer personally, the same individual who had given the assessment 6 years ago in this same station. We stood facing each other and I waited. The observer said that the assessment had been based on available data, that the data had been incomplete. I said that I understood. The observer said that there were those in the Kalori scientific community who were now very interested in understanding human propulsion and weapons physics, that requests would likely be submitted through formal channels. I said that we would review any such requests in accordance with conclave membership protocols. The observer looked at me for a moment, not the way it had looked at me 6 years ago, which was the way you look at something that has interrupted a meal. It looked at me the way you look at something you are genuinely trying to understand. Then it said, we did not expect this. I said, I know. It said, we should have been more careful. I said, yes, you should have. And that was the end of the conversation. The observer moved away, and I stood for a moment in the long metallic-smelling room surrounded by 47 species worth of noise and motion, and I thought about 6 years of accumulated distance. The docking corridor with the laughter, the translation device that was not current generation, the outer ring seat behind the structural pillar, the data chip on the conference table, the viewport at Ironville, and Nathan and Lena standing beside me with their cold coffees. The numbers from Keth. The 40 seconds it had taken the Vraxi commander to agree. Nathan had sent me a message that morning. It read, "They are already studying our engines." 2 sentences just like the one about the delivery system, just like faster than promised. I wrote back, "Let them." I found a quieter corner of the room and stood there for a few minutes, not avoiding anyone, just being still. Owen appeared after a while and stood beside me in the same quiet way he had stood beside me at the viewport on the Adrian 6 years ago, watching the conclave station grow in the window. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about the question seriously, which was how Owen asked things. He did not ask casually. He asked because he wanted to know. "Clear," I said. He nodded. "What comes next?" he said. I thought about that. I thought about the 14 hulls and the membership seat and the Uvathi delegate's small bow and the Kalori observer and the requests that would come through formal channels. I thought about Nathan's message and the engines they were already trying to understand and the things they had not asked about yet that they would eventually need to ask about. I thought about the next 1,000 years. "Everything," I said, "everything comes next." Owen almost smiled. He had picked up the habit from Gareth Holt, or maybe he had always had it and I had only just started noticing. We stood there a while longer and the room moved around us, and somewhere outside the conclave station, the stars were the same as they had always been, cold and very far apart and completely indifferent. But that was all right. We had never needed the stars to care about us. We had only ever needed the chance to show them what we were. We had that chance now. I was not going to waste it. The conclave had 47 members. In the years to come, they would learn things about humans that no assessment, no data projection, no mockery in a chamber full of alien delegates had come close to capturing. They would learn that we hold on to things, that we carry our history with us like weight in our bones, and that weight becomes the kind of strength you cannot manufacture and cannot train for and cannot imitate. They would learn that we do not forget what someone did with their chance to be decent. The Uvathi had voted for us when we were nothing. We would remember that for 1,000 years. We would be there for the Uvathi in every chamber, at every vote, in every moment when they needed someone in their corner, and we would never explain it and never ask for anything in return, because that was not how we kept count. They would learn that we are the species that built those 14 ships not because a government ordered it, and not because a strategy required it, but because 900,000 names deserved to matter. Because Carol deserved to matter. Because the photograph of the first tomatoes on Keth deserved to be in someone's memory long after the frame was gone. They would learn, eventually, that the thing they had called biological fragility was actually something else. That a species with a short lifespan and soft bodies and 100 ways to be killed builds its legacy differently than a species with 10,000 years to spare. We build it urgent. We build it like it matters right now. Because for us it does, because we are always aware, in a way that longer-lived species sometimes seem to forget, that the time we have is the time we have. We are not graceful in the way the conclave understands grace. We are not precise in the way they understand precision. We are not ancient. We are not elegant. We are not the species that arrives first and shapes the rules before anyone else gets there. But we are the species that gets there anyway. We are the species that the universe gave every reason to give up and that found, somewhere in the specific and unrepeatable combination of grief and stubbornness and love for what we had built, a reason not to. We are the species that built 14 ships in Jupiter's shadow while everyone was laughing, that walked into a hostile chamber and sat in the outer ring and took notes, that came back 6 years later to a reconfigured room and a 47-0 vote. The universe mocked us. The universe decided, early and without much consideration, what we were and what we would remain. The universe was wrong. I stood in the corner of the conclave's reception hall, with a glass of water in my hand and Owen beside me and 47 species worth of noise filling the air, and I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel that the work was done or that we had arrived somewhere final. What I felt was exactly what I had felt in the docking corridor at the end of that first visit, watching the conclave station shrink in the viewport of the Adrian, except inverted. Not the weight of how far we had to go. The weight of how far we had already come, and the understanding that this was not the end of the distance. It was the beginning. The stars were not laughing anymore, and honestly, neither was I. We were past all of that now. We were just getting started.